To give this discussion some context, I will say that over the last few years, of course, Europe has been faced with major disasters. We remember in the valleys of Vesuvie and La Roya, the storms, also the floods that occurred in the Benelux region, and forest fires in the south of Europe. And these disasters are natural disasters, but also human disasters, but economic disasters too. The financial consequences of these disasters have been significant, so we need to reflect on this. And we know that in 2021, the disasters cost over $170 million for the major disasters. So, of course, we will talk about the human disasters beyond these figures, and all the consequences of these events. And of course, these disasters are borderless. Of course, nature does not know any borders. And this means that there need to be concerted responses that show solidarity, that need to adapt to circumstances beyond borders, but also anticipation is very important. How do you plan for these disasters, as mentioned in the previous session, to ensure there is follow-up and reconstruction? And that is the case of your mission, Mr. Prefect. And so let's look at what you've done concretely. We imagine that you had major difficulties and we would like to know how you are organized in terms of prevention and management of these emergencies. So before we begin our debate, we have a video which explains the situation in the two valleys we mentioned, La Roya after the Alex storm, and this will in fact illustrate the needs beyond the disaster, the organizational and governance needs. Do we have the video?
La Roya, quand elle a mis à nu des vestiges, et notamment un endroit, en fait, on voit trois routes successives, c'est-à-dire la nôtre, la plus ancienne et la très très vieille, moyenâgeuse, toute petite. Et on voit bien que la voie de communication de la Roya a toujours été là. Brutalement, tous nos moyens de communication qui ont été coupés. Donc ça s'est au début réorganisé très très localement, c'est-à-dire village par village.
Au niveau du transport sur place, on s'est vite rapproché des problèmes de circulation, d'accès avec l'Italie, accès avec le haut des vallées aussi, Casterino, vallée des merveilles. Et on a œuvré sur les pistes pour remonter au moins sur Casterino, quoi.
Maintenant, pour relancer l'activité économique, il va falloir remonter des matériaux sur la vallée. Là, ça reste compliqué puisqu'on a deux solutions. C'est soit la route qui a été rétablie, mais de façon quand même précaire, soit la ligne de chemin de fer. Mais l'annonce vient d'être faite, ça va être fermé pour 3 semaines puisqu'on a un ouvrage en bas qui est fragilisé.
Suite à cet événement, on s'est rendu compte que finalement, compter sur un seul axe de circulation qui est la route, c'était miser sur quelque chose qui était un peu fragile. Et voilà, on s'est vite rendu compte que le train devenait quelque chose d'indispensable à garder, mais également aussi certains sentiers de montagne, sentiers parallèles qui étaient avant des sentiers muletiers et qui sont petit à petit en train de disparaître. Et encore d'autres chemins en montagne pédestres qui ont complètement disparu, qu'on a commencé doucement à réouvrir juste comme ça en bénévolat, quoi, pour l'instant. Et là, petit à petit, on voit beaucoup de véhicules minibus qui circulent et énormément de vélos, quoi. Énormément de vélos, des privés qui ont récupéré des vélos électriques, même des vélos normaux, hein, même pour rejoindre un village à l'autre, des gens qui travaillent en vélo un peu de partout. Et nous-mêmes, acteurs de la montagne, plutôt que d'y aller en 4x4, on s'est vite retrouvés à rejoindre les chantiers avec les vélos, quoi.
La vallée de la Roya, c'est historiquement depuis très très longtemps la vallée de passage entre le Piémont et la Côte d'Azur. C'est vraiment l'axe principal. Il y a eu un élan de solidarité de la part des Italiens qui sont venus nous aider en fait. Ce lien-là, il ne faut certainement pas qu'il soit coupé, il faut qu'il soit rétabli le plus vite possible. Et de la même manière que les voies de communication doivent être mixtes, ce lien-là doit être à nouveau mixte, c'est-à-dire avec le train et avec la route.
Questo ultimo evento climatico ci ha fatto molto riflettere, più che altro perché la viabilità delle strade purtroppo non dipende da noi. Speriamo anche per la prossima stagione in primavera che sia possibile ripristinare la viabilità della strada provinciale in montagna. Abbiamo chiesto agli enti preposti se hanno qualche idea di se ci saranno i soldi, ma noi lo speriamo perché i danni in tutta la valle e anche nelle valli limitrofe sono ingenti, sono stati ingenti a seguito della tempesta e quindi non sappiamo ancora, ecco, fino a dove ci saranno i soldi per ripristinare la viabilità. Noi ce lo auguriamo.
Merci. Alors, du coup, on va rebondir directement. Ça vous a fait une belle introduction.
Thank you. Well, this was the perfect introduction. Monsieur Pelletier, you were named, you were designated a few days after this storm to pilot reconstruction works. This is what you told me. I was appointed in order to help with reconstruction on the French side. So when were you appointed, and also what did you organize at that time? Can you describe the situation that you inherited in terms of the necessary solidarity of the organization that was required when you arrived? And how are things organized today in terms of management and planning? Hello, Sophie. Hello, everyone. Well, the images that we've just seen, well, that was in the past. This Alex storm that has been quickly summarized in the video. Well, you remember it was a storm that crossed France from the west to the east, and that stopped in the Alpes Maritime department, and that encountered a Mediterranean event, which created a major disturbance, which generated the national disaster, leading to the most significant damage in metropolitan France since 1845. 100 kilometers of highways destroyed, approximately 200 kilometers of rail network. Following the storm in October 2020, there were villages that were cut off from the rest of the world for several weeks in La Roya, the valley of the Quiné and the Moyen Var. So we're talking about a significant territory with only 15 million inhabitants. With 15,000 inhabitants. And of course, we are on the borders with Italy, and on the Piedmont side in Italy, and Liguria, Ventimiglia. Bearing in mind, as President Rotner said earlier, we share, of course, some areas since La Roya, whose source is above the Tongue, actually exits at Ventimiglia into the Mediterranean. So I was appointed on the 14th of October 2020, following the President of the Republic's visits on the ground, who committed state resources to local authorities to ensure a resilient and sustainable reconstruction. So, first of all, emergencies had to be managed. That was the first task. As soon as possible, with the local authorities, with private operators, there was a need to restore the functionality of traffic, the needs in terms of water and electricity. For those who lived through this disaster, certain of the valley areas were not only cut off from the rest of the world, but there were no phone links either. From the Friday, 2nd of October, at the end of the afternoon, there were no more phones, no more electricity, nothing. So you were appointed on the French side, and how do you carry out your work? Yes, of course. I was coming to this, and this shows the limits, perhaps, of this exercise. I'm not a cross-border resident, but I work an awful lot with our Italian friends, and we need to understand the local context of the Haute-Roya, in particular, which was an Italian territory until 1947, then joined up with France, and there are powerful links, economic, historical, and President Rotner also was mentioning this earlier. I think in these territories we have citizens who really live the cross-border experience in their flesh. And there are links that are often familial and daily relations that they have in their economic life and their exchanges and so on. So you have a very specific territory that is connected with the Limon Valley. And of course, the Alex storm affected Italy too, but less so. There was less damage caused in Italy, but after the storm, you had a border which was cut off because there was no more any highway or road link. And it took a few weeks to be able to reconnect the railway link because we have a major territorial resource shared between France and Italy, and that is the railway line Cuneo, Bray, Ventimiglia, Nice. As compared to the other territories that we spoke of earlier that are living areas that are very sort of unified. Here, you had to reorganize all this. There was a physical border. And how do you manage, for example, if you can't communicate by phone? We'd like to know how you organize yourselves. Have you created bodies that's enabled to build for the future? So how do you move on to the reconstruction exercise? Well, we work on a daily basis with our Italian colleagues, and this is where we see perhaps that there are some problems in the mechanism, i.e. the alert mechanisms have worked well. They were shared with the Italians, but via uh, the police and customs cooperation department between France and Italy. And here we have daily relations on issues of security. And it's via the CPPD that we shared these meteorological alerts. We didn't manage the crisis jointly, simply because what was essential, of course, what was the helicopters, for example, could not actually across the mountains. That was a difficulty. We also worked from a legal point of view in Saint-Martin-Vésubie and in Sainte-Maldas de Tendre. And this is quite morbid, but we had to fish out bodies from cemeteries that had been flooded and the bodies had been carried away into the Mediterranean. This was very painful. And we realized in terms of organization there were certain failures, i.e. It is the initiatives that we've taken with our Italian colleagues, with the mayors of towns, because reconstruction, of course, went through mayors, of course, which were very important. We have contacts with the Piedmont region, with Liguria, and one major topic was ensuring that the railway line could be operational once again. And it's a very complicated railway line that was built at the beginning of the 20th century, which was bombed on several occasions, that we renovated in 1979, but based on an agreement with Italy, with some anachronisms, because the maintenance of the line was paid for by the Italians on the basis of damage caused by the war, Second World War. That was a bit strange in 1970, of course, over 25 years after the end of the Second World War. 20 million euros were committed, and we were able to restore that railway line, which is called the railway of life, really, because it enables the traffic across the border. And this line enabled us very quickly to receive help in Italy in terms of food, for example. And this is where we see infrastructures are very important for this work that we do on a daily basis. Well, I'm sure that Mr. Vivo will have something to say about this a little later, but let us also talk about anticipation now, prevention. How do you prevent risks? And let us now move on to Iliyana Cvetanova. You are Bulgarian. You're going to speak in English. I will carry on in French if I may. So feel free to speak in English. And you are responsible for a cross-border project between Bulgaria and North Macedonia, which is currently being implemented. It's just starting. It's not completely operational yet, and it is funded by the EU via the Interreg program. And we see that the Interreg program is very present, is very helpful, There are some people who tell us that, in fact, it is one of the main engines for funding these projects, very important in cross-border areas. So can you tell us about this cross-border cooperation in forest firefighting? Can you tell us more about what this is about? And tell us how you manage the status of the people that you wish to train to fight against forest fires. You explained that on the one hand there were volunteers, on the other ones there are professionals, so very different statuses. So how do you manage this project in terms of governance or an ad hoc cooperation system?
Hello everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of the forum. Well, the project actually is already in process, and at this moment, what we are doing is the information campaign, because we have planned two information campaigns. First, to promote the volunteers, and the second about prevention of the forest fighters. The whole project is focused from the Bulgarian part to promote the volunteers and to supply them with some protective equipment. But from the part of the Republic of North Macedonia, because they still don't have any volunteers for Mirovation, we are focused there of the regional fire departments. Yeah, and what we have managed to do until now is to establish a network of some natural and environmental hazards. It's, of course, in just a network between our departments of fire departments and the volunteer for Mirovation, which we have to each municipality. I mean in Bulgaria, but in North Macedonia only for the fire departments which are regionally. So the big concern and the big question and our request to our view is to give us examples how to organize those for Mirovation, how to react together, how to be more effective, to multiply the good practice which you have, and to be honest, to take one of your good examples.
So, on va les écouter. Je pense qu'on vous a aussi envoyé beaucoup d'informations.
Well, thank you for that, certainly. And hopefully we've sent you lots of information that could be useful. It is a very specific association with local authorities and very different administrative bodies. Monsieur Vivo, from the European Commission, in charge of disaster risk management, can you tell us what you do? And what are the political or economic, technical obstacles that you might have? What are the difficulties that you encounter in terms of disaster risk management in Europe? Thank you, Sophie, and thank you for the MOT for having invited me. Yes, I work within the DG ECHO. That's the Directorate General for Civil Protection and Humanitarian Operations within the European Commission. We have a European mechanism for civil protection that exists now for since 2001, for the last 20 years, and this mechanism has evolved over the years, and it is a mechanism which is focused on the responses, on emergency responses, for a very simple reason, is that the European Treaty, via the principle of solidarity, obliges member states to come to the help of another member states when those other member states are overwhelmed by an emergency. But since 2001, of course, the world has changed, including the management of disasters. There is an international consensus at the United Nations. Of course, they've stressed the importance of prevention. And we've had increasing evidence that we need to work upstream of disasters, or before they happen, to have an impact and be able to save lives and our economy. But as you say, there are indeed difficulties and obstacles when we talk about prevention in particular. In terms of the response, I would say that there is a mechanism that has been well tried and with members of the EU plus other countries. We are 33 countries in Europe that can launch these mechanisms and use resources that are in a joint capacity park, as we call it. So that works very well in terms of response. Prevention, that's another matter. That's much more difficult. We have political challenges because, well, at local level, when we talk about local authorities or at European level, prevention is not an easy topic to sell, shall I say. Prevention requires much investment, and all too often the return on investment, of course, is beyond the political horizon of our governments and decision makers, and that return perhaps sometimes never comes. Because it's very easy to take a photograph from an airplane, from a Canadair. It's much more difficult to take a photograph of a prevention program. It hasn't happened, so how do you take a photograph of it? It's much more difficult to sell and therefore mobilize budgets at all levels, at local level, regional, national, and European level. Please reassure Mrs. Cvetanova, because what you're telling her is that it's an impossible task that she has. No, of course not. No, from a technical point of view, of course, we need to manage crisis, manage risk. They're very two different things. Civil protection is one aspect of the mechanism of risk management, and risk is a transversal theme which goes beyond the classical organization of our governments, including the EU Commission in our Directorate General. If we talk about the environment of critical infrastructures, so we do have this challenge. So what are we doing? We are currently working at two levels. A political level, we have decisions to make. It's not a directive. Of course, there is the famous directive on the floods, of course. That is a very powerful instrument. And there are sanctions and penalties for member states if they don't implement plans to manage floods cross-border areas in particular. It is quite different for us, but since 2019, we've introduced obligations so that countries can make an inventory of their risks by focusing on cross-border risks and what measures they have in place to manage those risks. And we'll see, in fact, the first analysis, the first report that will summarize this inventory. This will be published at the end of this year. So this will give us a first idea of the current situation in Europe. There'll be a map for the risks involved. And I would complete on the other aspect, the political aspect and the financial aspects. There are several minor projects that we are funding. Compared to Interreg, of course, we are a very modest program, but we are very focused on risk and preparation. And so we work from the grassroots with local authorities, the Red Cross, at regional and national and international level. We fund the projects that serve as think tanks or experimental laboratories, and then this can be scaled up at regional and national and European level. So you're telling us that the cross-border question can be a laboratory for you to experiment. It's something that can inspire you. Yes, we can provide good practices and examples, certainly that I could share with you, Mrs. Cvetanova. Thank you. And Monsieur Pelletier, you told us how you were working with Italy. The European Union, does it help in this respect? Because in the management of disasters, what is important and urgent is local organization. So can the EU be of any help besides financial help? Well, we manage the events with national resources, not only local resources. We didn't call upon the EU and European solidarity because it was not necessary. However, I would say that we benefited from the Solidarity Fund of the European Union for reconstruction, 160 million euros, as I mentioned, that enabled us to cover some costs for crisis management, but also enabled us to fund reconstruction. And the ambition, of course, is to try and reconstruct better in a more sustainable fashion. And I'd like to say a few words on citizens, since you mentioned this earlier. What we're trying to do, we're trying to build a reconstruction model. We've done this with engineers, with specialists of risk and management, because we, of course, we have to draw all the lessons we can from the events that occurred. But with the we thought about the development and attractiveness of these areas, of course, and so we concerted politically, and it would have been a good thing to do this with Italy. We could only do this on the French side with French colleagues and representatives, but at some point it is very important to ask the local inhabitants how they see their future after a disaster. The issues of conservation of the environment, of biodiversity, and so on. We have the National Park of the Mercantour, of course, and this has to be worked on with our Italian colleagues. So we've worked on several issues, and today I'm reconnecting with our Italian friends. For example, to take one example, to imagine in these valleys, we can't imagine a sustainable project in terms of tourism without our Italian friends. And it's very agreeable to work with our Italian colleagues, although, of course, and I anticipate a question that you might have in terms of administration, of course. The bureaucracies, of course, on a daily basis, of course, don't always cooperate fully. And sometimes it is very difficult to identify who is the counterpart in the other country who will be able to make decisions. We're not exemplary, of course, in France, but we had to manage during the Alex storm. The Alex storm completely changed the hydromorphology of rivers, the local geology. And so we have a source in Porad for drinkable water. And to manage on the Italian side, there is an international agreement. And this well, since the storm Alex, has suffered because the underground soil, in fact, has very difficulty in being replenished with fresh water. In Italy, it's more decentralized, perhaps, but there are bodies that at some point emerge and would ask for complementary studies. So from an administrative point of view, there is heavy bureaucracy locally, it has to be said. And this does act as an obstacle. And we talked about Alcotra, for example, which is managed by the Auvergne-Rhône-Alpes region, not the PACA region. We have mechanisms that are very thematic, but what we need, and we'll have to find the right balance on both sides of the border, and the Treaty of Quirinal will help us to find bodies, local bodies that are operational and that can make decisions.
So you've spoken about Italy. Did you include the Principality of Monaco too? And the other question is whether you were able to talk with other transalpine regions. across various countries because you experience something that could happen again. So that would be to anticipate. So on the first point, yes, the Sovereign Prince of Monaco helped us a lot in material terms. He offered equipment to the commune, so his help was very precious. The Red Cross, Monaco Red Cross was also there, and they helped us because they freed up €1 million for each valley, and we worked with the Foundation on heritage objects, which was very important too. So working particularly on tourist aspects as well, agricultural aspects as well, because agricultural heritage is also important. On terms of cooperation with other countries locally, we discussed with Belgians, so not Transalpine, but we were contacted by our Belgian friends who asked us how we were managing the emergency, how we were approaching reconstruction, and we needed to discuss once again environmental matters. So with citizen consultation, which the French state put in place in the valleys, which revealed one thing, which was that citizens are experts in their day-to-day life, their environment. And once again, what we noticed across all of these subjects was that citizens represent the sustainability elements in exercises, in activities that are associated with them. It's very important to listen to them. And the question you were asking earlier on is that the public policies need to be carried along by the general public. Mr. Vivo, please could you answer? The interpreter apologizes. There is background noise.
Tout à l'heure aussi, c'est est-ce que vous avez
Driver's
des
been bad from
exemples
yawning employee as a lunch dumbass
de
nigga. Fuck wrong with you,
sensibilisation,
mad
de
yourself. You
prévention?
midget
The
plastic.
interpreter apologizes. There is too much background noise at the moment. The interpreter apologizes. There is background noise. So there was a project in 2021.
Améliorer la gestion de la donnée, qui est clé, et c'est aussi une métaphore, je pense, de la.
I think the interpreter apologizes for the background noise which has interfered with the sound channel. So data is collected, meteorological and private sector tools are a resource which is a tool for managing flood by facilitating the sharing of information amongst public and private partners on both sides of the border to improve the resolution and the impact of these events. That's just one example. The challenge, we have other challenges too on prevention of floods, but we have other examples which we could raise earlier on. We have a database with 150 projects which we have, which were financed between Romania and Bulgaria. The good news is that North Macedonia is one of the mechanism countries, and as I was saying, they're not a member state, but they are part of the European mechanism for prevention. So they have access to our finance. So that's good news for you to suggest projects between the two countries. But there's also a project which seeks to manage volunteers on different legal bases with different procedures. So we have lots of good practices in these projects. The challenge is to know how to escalate this, how to replicate this project. The sums available do not represent sufficient, but it's the best practice, it's good practice that through governments we can escalate to the national level. Small question for you again, and then we will move towards a closure. You were telling me that it's not always easy to ask states to invest in crisis management, which is different from the risk. So anticipating, seeking what you wish to put to one side. What arguments do you put forward to set up initiatives and release resources? So we know basically that we will be affected by a crisis, but you need to anticipate. So what are the arguments? I'm going to give you an example that we see in 2021. We had carry out a study on prevention and anticipation. You can see on our website. So this is interesting because on the basis of an analysis of 75 examples, concrete examples of investment of different sorts beforehand, physical investments to prevent, to build structures to resist earthquakes, for example. From these examples, we saw a return on investment, 20 returns on investment in these studies on prevention. So the feedback is important. The advantages are greater than the costs to a great extent, even if there is not a disaster. And I think that that is a message that we need to share with our political leaders, because not only are these projects saving human lives and reducing costs, damage, economic losses associated with human lives, infrastructures, and so on. But they improve productivity because we improve the agricultural sector, we increase the value of the property, we improve the environmental benefits. So there are benefits which are represented, which we see even if there is no disaster. That is the logic we are trying to share. So we are a state mechanism, we're not a regional or a town mechanism. And I think that this is a good thing to say, that we are trying to see that we are trying to reach grassroots level, going through national levels, whilst leveraging the European mechanism for civic protection. I think we should close this discussion with questions that you might like to ask Mrs. Cvetanova. Are there things that you needed? You came telling us that I'm not going to speak much, but I want to have answers. Have you had answers? Is there a subject, blind spot that you would like us to raise now? It's over to you.
That's okay.
Well, the two gentlemen,
Use your
thank you
microphone.
for the all examples and the good advices about this
Iliyana,
and your experiences.
use your microphone
Oops,
closer to you.
sorry, yeah, but you hear me, yeah. And what else to ask? I don't know. We can gather everything if it's like Mr. Vivo told me. We can check everything and we can gather the good examples. Your experience is amazing. I mean, there you have managed to deal with something which was really scared, and I managed to take a look and to read some of this. And congratulations, you did it very well. Well, what we are going to do and what we are looking for, it's not only the good examples, but the practice which will be multiplied, which will give us a really efficient, how to say, lessons.
Lessons.
Yeah, and which
Concrete
we can use.
and operational. Okay, I was speaking in English, so I was saying concrete responses and helps and examples.
Yes.
The other thing you told me, and I think you did, vous l'avez introduit, I'm sorry.
You raised this. I'm sorry, I could speak English, but I think it's easier to go back to French. So this question of the status of the people involved during crises, volunteers, people who intervene, I don't know how they are managed in a case like yours, or where during the crisis, questions of insurance, you were saying there were questions of status, questions of timetables, lots of things which can be complex when they need to be managed across borders because people will not react or intervene in the same way. So when things become urgent, all of that needs to be taken account. You need to be aware of that during complex situations. I do not know if these subjects are handled at a European level to handle things as cited by Mrs. Cvetanova, or how these things are raised by you. And then we'll finish there. Yes, we were talking about good practices. There are rules for the committing people who form part of the response mechanism that we can share. We can consider also there's the subject of working hours and insurance, which is raised too. All of that we work with multinational teams. That is interesting as well. We can share different approaches. Very good. So one thing to close, there is a cooperation, spontaneous cooperation from the Italian side without there being any specific organization. There was institutional cooperation on very concrete things, but there was also the creation of associations on the French side. There was a lot of support shown there. It was massive support. So in terms of external lessons, beyond the importance of always learning more about the management and prevention of risks, that must also come from citizens. We need to find the right way to explain when there is a red alert. There are reflexes that we need to have. We don't go to get children from school. We don't take to the roads. There's not just public authorities who manage crises. You also need to have a good engagement by residents, and we need to take account of risks and also consider the future in terms of reconstruction, which can be resilient and sustainable. And there too, innovation is something which should guide us. You were talking about mobility. I'm talking about this railway line. Tomorrow we're going to put in place freight trains, but with hydrogen powered locomotives. And the European Investment Bank, which just thus far was working with countries of the East, is now providing support through European finance to try to find sustainable solutions to enable those regions which have been affected, which have been torn apart, which suffered considerable damage, can think of a future and then to be models for reconstruction, not just in the recreation of infrastructures, but also the future, as you can imagine it, across all the activities I raised earlier, to make the cross-border region more rich, because we share cross-border resources, to strengthen the hospitals, which we will do with the Italians, because we can then share the resource with them. So, okay, well, remember this, cross-border regions during a crisis are a place which can inspire us through our experience, which is even more complicated than the crisis itself. You manage, and you have managed to manage, you will need to manage situations which are particularly complex. Thank you very much for explaining this to us, to giving us things to consider, to have continued, to have agreed to share this information with us. I have not handed over to the floor. I have noted some questions, but I hope you will forgive me, but I think you now wish to go to lunch and come back this afternoon, I hope. Thank you very much. Thank you to our participants.